But ultimately, I refer to you as a Renaissance woman, which, I relate to because for those who want to put somebody like yourself, and I relate, into a round hole, that's like just not okay. Doesn't
Well,
serve the soul.
you are a Renaissance woman. I mean, it's and a nod and gratitude for you referring to me that way. But I see you that way, and weirdly enough, even when we met many, many, many years ago, that made me have an affinity and a kinship with you that was inherent and innate, because it's that thing of voices of women. Voices of women, have we been muted a lot in our industry, and what does that mean, and where is the lack of our voice coming back at us in this mirrored reflection of, we've pillaged the planet, we were supposed to be stewards, we are having tons of things in the news that are about violence. Well, maybe we've trended that way with our art. And I think we've told kids, by what we prioritize war over education and art and music. And I look at your background and it's full of vivid color. When you think about institutions where children are being educated, they're not.
Welcome to Camp Fifi Uncensored podcast. We are so excited for you to hear this next conversation with our guest, Jocelyn Wright. And welcome to our season 4 featuring powerful women. Jocelyn is an author, a director, a performer, a costume designer, and she has a real finger on the pulse of humanity, and just really had a delicious part 1 conversation with her. So grab that coffee and grab that cannoli, because here we go. Welcome, Jocelyn Wright. Welcome so much to this podcast. And we have so much to talk about, and hopefully we'll be able to squeeze it all in 2 hours. And to the audience that may not know you, you're a writer and a director and a performer, and you're a musician. You write music, and you've been a costume designer, and literally I would call you a Renaissance woman, because I know that you're an author. And I mean, so the writing is, of course, is all inclusive, but writing books is separate of like rewriting scripts or scripts in general. So there's just, I'm saying you're an author of words in all aspects. And but ultimately I refer to you as a Renaissance woman, which, I relate to because for those who want to put somebody like yourself, and I relate, into a round hole, that's like just not okay. Doesn't serve the soul.
You are a Renaissance woman. I mean, it's and a nod and gratitude for you referring to me that way. But I see you that way, and weirdly enough, even when we met many, many, many years ago, that made me have an affinity and a kinship with you that was inherent and innate, because it's that thing of voices of women. Voices of women, have we been muted a lot in our industry, and what does that mean, and where is the lack of our voice coming back at us in this mirrored reflection of, we've pillaged the planet, we were supposed to be stewards, we are having tons of things in the news that are about violence. Well, maybe we've trended that way with our art. And I think we've told kids, by what we prioritize war over education and art and music. And I look at your background and it's full of vivid color. When you think about institutions where children are being educated, they're not.
It's that pale green that makes you sick.
It does. It makes you feel nauseated.
It's true in a rehab place as well, whether you're rehabbing somebody of any age.
Yeah.
And that's going to get up onto another shoot. But to your point, you're right. You're correct. The subconscious mind is being programmed in a way that, and it is interesting to your point about the power of one's voice, the power of being seen, the power of being heard. The reason why this particular season is about powerful women is because it is throughout history, and I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, but I certainly, for every powerful woman that, in most cases throughout history, going all the way back to what, BC, AD, whomever, whatever, any woman that has held power has, has been, held to this higher stake, has
Yeah.
been betrayed, has been
Shamed and erased. I mean, so many of the women, I'm going to turn off this light because I think it's making a weird light. So many of the women of real power who contributed have been erased from mundane things like Tupperware. I don't know if you know, the whole going into the home and setting them was done by a woman whose name is like nowhere on the real Tupperware history. There was a time, because I'd been plagiarized by a dear friend in a work situation that put me very much behind the 8 ball. I went on a quest about what businesses were founded in lies or denying someone credit, not always women. Levi Strauss didn't invent jeans. He bought it off of a guy who was very creative but broke. And then he made that guy the floor manager in one of their stores. And, and again, there's a contempt.
I mean, Ray Kroc and McDonald's. He
Oh my
took
God.
the two brothers' idea.
Yeah.
And yet he was the one that, like, in that case, just on a personal level, not personal, like in my bank account, personal, God willing, it would have been lovely. But I mean, friends who I went to college with, who, ironically, his parents were plucked out of Ohio and sent to England, and they launched McDonald's, and it made them multi-millionaires. And to your point, like, leveraging comes in so many different ways. Sorry, there will be dog effects in the background.
Dogs. I love dogs. Great.
They are surrounding us right now. But yeah, there's just and getting back to women, it's interesting. Like, I study and I work with and I align with a lot of women who are on their own spiritual manifestation quests and being seen and being heard in safe spaces. And, some of them talk about, and this is nothing that I ever thought of in my own realm, but where they talk about we're the witches. And it's interesting to say and use that term because I will never forget how Scarlet Letter, was just such an impressionable book on me. And this, the burn and its state, like that's bringing them to the center and like just making them so wrong. And I just remember thinking, how horrific. But I never was in like a past life mentality at that state of mind, at that stage of my life. I mean, at 11 years old, that was not something I was conscious of. I would say more in the last 20 years. And this may sound just like, people who are following this conversation are going to be like, the wind is blowing in one direction and then the next, and yes, it will be in our conversation. But to that point, it's like, I would imagine if women and men, for that matter, were in touch with the women in their lives and are open-minded, would have a sensitivity and a sensibility of the importance of the woman's voice, the importance of the woman's contribution, the importance of not shunning her, the importance of not destroying her. And yet, ironically, in our world, just since 2016, politically speaking, and this is not a political show, but it is very important when it regards to the power of women, that no matter what your politics, no matter what your beliefs are, when women, whether it was the 1919 suffragettes or the women of the movement in the late 60s, early 70s, who were the quote unquote bra burners and all that, and the feminists, as they were referred to, they did not fight for the sake of because they had nothing better to do. On the contrary. And what women don't, in many cases seem to realize, and I don't know if it's a lack of civic history or the lack of just individuals knowing history or just a sense of entitlement. But what those women fought for was so much more than just the right to make a decision over your body. It was the right to have this kind of a conversation safely. It was the right to
Be
have your bank
incarcerated
account.
as mentally insane because they had an opinion or they read too much or they were frustrated by the inequities. Here's the crazy thing to me, and I definitely see the analogous thing about witches. I even have a poem that I wrote about burning together because I think
Mm,
we women, that is an energy we share. We know what it was to culturally be burned, just the way that Black culture understands what it was to be lynched because of the fallacy of the different races.
right.
We, because gender being, submersive and made submissive, we were vilified and burned, and we've had to stand up for human rights. But the interesting thing too, at the core of that battle, is if women aren't fighting for the humanity and the lack of we shouldn't have a culture of contempt. People say, oh, they want to say this is a Christian nation, which it isn't. It's a nation where you're allowed to be Christian. But if you really believe in God and Christ and the teachings, as I am actually a believer, I'm appalled by what I see trending in the culture
Mm,
of taking away women's rights. This again, the key censorship really in the original church kept Mary Magdalene's role sort of as a backdrop, and as it also hijacked it into Christianity instead of a Jewish revolution, which is
right,
what the Romans were afraid of. So, I mean,
right.
this history of suppressive information, silencing women's voices, silencing their roles, and even more importantly, as we vote, and harkening back to the feminists, I actually dramaturged for Mary McDonnell,
Mm,
doing the role of Gloria Steinem, and
okay.
because of that, it was so great. It was an amazing process, and it was an amazing play, and she's an amazing actress, and it was a privilege, and I love Gloria Steinem. But going into the research, what really struck me, what really put the knife in the hand of people like Phyllis Schlafly and those people to thwart the ERA, which again is just women saying, if I'm going to be taxed in this nation, I must be represented in this nation. Then that goes all the way back to the American Revolution.
Sure.
We should not be taxed without representation, and women are. We should
Mhm.
have a tax strike, try to run this country without women's money. We pay a lot in taxes. We don't take as much from the system. We're not as incarcerated. Our healthcare, they do these research studies on men's medicine. They put a lot of money into it, and then they're like, and give it to the women. And they don't really know what the ramifications are. I did
Oh,
medical training.
no.
They don't know at all. And
Uh,
because you're a cancer survivor and what you had to endure, it's obscene,
But
you
not
know.
only being a cancer survivor, also to that point as a pre-med student
That's
in the
right.
80s, I remember the AMA just being like, all the money was going towards,
Now
and I'm
research.
not anti-white man, this I know, and the public needs to know, but all the research was being done on white men. And the reason why I went public through my ovarian cancer, that many people in my community or greater community um, heard me. The reason why it was important for me to speak up was because to that point, the things had not really shifted that much from the time I was a pre-med student until now regarding women's health care, women's research, women's funding, regarding all around the medical and the fact that there I was, somebody who was very proactive and
Yeah.
very much an advocate and very conscientious, having had this happen to myself after being misdiagnosed and treated in such a manner where it was like, oh, well, we're just going to chalk it up to maturation of your vagina.
Yeah.
I mean, are you kidding me
Oh,
right now?
the
Like,
gaslighting
who
and
speaks to men like
dismissing.
that?
Yeah. No, the gaslighting and dismissing. I have multiple chronic autoimmune disorders, and I presented at 19 and didn't respond well to what the doctor was giving me, which was massive doses of steroids that would be categorized as malpractice now. But this was again
Mhm,
early 80s. I was a 19-year-old girl doing
mhm.
whatever the doctor told me. And it changed my body in a way that was radical and disturbing. And it didn't make me better. And when I resisted, he wrote me down as a non-compliant patient, which I don't know if you've ever had any experience, but if you are non-compliant, you are so screwed screwed in our healthcare system. And again, non-compliant can be, I don't want to take something I think is poisonous, or I don't
Mhm,
want to take something I'm allergic to.
mhm.
And yet I had bad reactions to steroids, and the shots were making me sicker, and the creams were ripping my skin. And yet, because it was the only protocol they had in place, they aggressively
Mhm.
gaslit me. They would patronize me. And again, 19-year-old girl who had been raised to respect and revere doctors. My
Yeah.
father was in medical advertising, and I went to AMA conventions my entire life,
Mhm,
loving, like, thinking doctors were like, oh, God's handmaidens, practically,
mhm,
like coming
mhm,
down to minister. And they should be. And it's
mhm,
interesting too, back to this idea of the feminist thing, so much for feminism. I think what tanked us, and it's a tragedy, is because women, whether they have children or not, and
mhm.
I am not a woman with a child, but to me, every child belongs to me, and my concern, and my, if I see a child lost, or, and I have no doubt that you're that way. I've
Oh,
seen,
definitely a mother of the world for
well, I
sure.
saw you work with a child, because we worked with a child on a film we did together many years ago that was a very sensitive subject. And we both were working very hard to make that little girl not be scared and be comfortable. And I remember that well. And again, that thing about maternal instinct that says we mother everyone. So when this divisive forces came rising out of the right with all this money and power, and they said they were coming after people who are feminists because they're pro-trans or they're pro-gay, and Bella Abzug, and people like Shirley Chisholm. And I was growing up in New York at the time. I was a little girl, and those were my heroes, and so was
Yeah,
Gloria Steinem.
yeah.
And they, because they're human beings who love, and like all mothers say, these are our children. You cannot reject trans children. You cannot reject trans people. You cannot reject, gay people. And that is actually what really tanked the era. And it's so tragic, because in the long run, we look, historically speaking, the Equal Rights Amendment would do us a great service now, just as the Women's Fair Act that Kennedy passed has saved so many transgender people now who are under attack. And that's where we need to fuse together, because when I speak to transgender women and they share with me, like, it's scary and I feel under attack, it's like, that's being a woman, my darling. And
Yes,
that is a woman's experience. I knew Candy
yes.
Darling was an innovative transgender person. She was one of Andy Warhol's. I knew her as a little girl to be she was like a fantasy figure. Her skin was perfection, but all those hormones killed her in the end. And she was hugely talented. And what we need to find is a way where gender normatives that are enslaving stop enslaving us, so that women have rights as humans, as trans, because there are really 5 or 6 genders. So, and for any parent who has a child in the 80s and the 90s, they were reassigning gender, traumatizing children with surgeries at birth, and the parents blindly went ahead and did what the doctors recommended, as so many. I have a cousin who went through brutal conversion
Oh,
therapy. And I have a non-binary niece, and I watched my brother-in-law be unkind to her in ways that made me furious and afraid. I mean, we need to find a way to communicate about these volatile issues, to have laws that protect the humanity, the autonomy, that stop contempt wherever it rises up to crush people. We
mhm.
need that. But the dialogue that you are creating a space for is essential to that too, because you're not even aware of an issue until it hits you personally,
Correct.
unless art comes in and tells you why it's so important that you're sharing cancer. Women are going to get a diagnosis tomorrow. My sister died of cancer. She got sarcoma, and it went all over her body, and it was shocking and terrifying, but I was ready for it because my mother had had cancer 4 years before, and I was able to help my sister the best, because it is a battle, win or lose, in the sense of whether you survive, the dignity and your humanity, and how to navigate the gaslighting or the dismissive faux diagnoses that go
Oh,
like
yeah.
this. Oh, you're having what? It's vaginal atrophy. And it's like, well, no, it's not. And I know the difference. And you cannot gaslight me, and I won't pay for it.
No, and it's interesting because I knew just in that particular situation, I knew that it was a risk to go public because people either want to see people either want to celebrate people and raise people up, and that's my tribe, or people want to see people fall. And
Yeah.
people want to see people fail, and people want to be able to eliminate so they feel more empowered. And the truth is that's not the empowerment that I align with. And I know that you don't align with. I can't, not that I'm speaking for you. But I
No,
knew
I totally
that.
agree with that, and I've seen that in our industry, and especially with women, there's a sense that there can only be one magnetic woman in the room, whereas men, and again, this is again the disparity of access to power and how it plays out in our own sense of competition, because that small
Mhm,
scrap of meat
mhm,
that's left
mhm,
for women, if there's only
mhm.
going to be one woman allowed here, wah! And again, that is an hallucinatory reality. We're over 50% of the population. And in scientific reality, women can procreate other women without sperm. And that's a chromosomal fusion. That's so when we really look at all the dynamics of gender and expendability, which seems to be the dialectic of the incel crowd, as an older woman who's fat and not and has multiple autoimmune disorders and no children and unmarried, I know they'd shoot me on sight and be proud of it. And there's a whole culture waiting to applaud them, and that's a tragedy of lack of education. It's the History Channel playing 24-hour Hitler porn. It's all that sort of weird. I mean, I don't know if you ever have, back when I had normal click cable, I had liked the History Channel. I really liked it. And then all of a sudden it was like, Hitler, the great things about Hitler. And I was just like, what? Who's doing this programming?
I have to be frank. I haven't watched the History Channel in so long, and yet I used to a lot.
Me
But if I
too.
saw that, I would be like, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, I was the kid who was raised in a Sunday school that showed more Holocaust movies than God could imagine. To be reminded that history can repeat. So my own perspective was that would not be the side of the lane I would be on, like
Oh my, well, and here's
celebrating
no,
this
and
genius
they
who led a
lost.
movement.
I know, and they lost, and they were lousy, and they were monsters, and they were psychos, and they were drugged up on coke. And again, it's that weird thing. But I don't know about your college experience. I went to USC,
Mm-hmm.
and the football culture there was very rape culture, and so was the sorority and fraternity culture. I had very horrible experiences at USC, and don't really embrace it as my alma mater the way that I do my high school, which I went to boarding school, which I was very glad of because I had a lot of chaos amidst privilege. And boarding school was a resolve for me. It was an institution where equity and fairness played out in rules. You did something wrong, there were consequences. You paid the toll. You got forgiven, and you move forward, and everyone let go. There was no hitting or screaming or throwing food or waving of guns, and I was really glad.
And I ditto that experience, having also gone to boarding school, and that was very much my experience,
Yeah,
100%.
yeah,
I very much celebrate it. And
yeah,
people who go to boarding school don't necessarily go to boarding school because they're being disposed of from their family.
yeah, yeah,
That myth has got to be shattered as well.
yeah.
So
No,
go ahead,
no,
please.
no. Oh, and again, legacy issues, and again, privileges, whatever that means. I mean,
Hmm.
we have a terrible mistake in our culture. We overly revere the rich, and we
Yeah.
hallucinatorily assume that they have no issues. And many rich families are cancerous and cankerous right at their core, which, pull it back. We're seeing that every day these days, like the horror. and don't look too close at that perfect white picket fence. But, that acquisitional concept of joy and happiness. And as a privileged child, I often saw my friends who I could see how much their parents prioritized them and
Mm,
loved them,
mm,
and felt incredible envy. And I could give them an extra party dress. I could give them a top, I had so many toys or whatever. I can give you that. Oh, my old roller skates aren't really that used. Here, have them. You can't afford a new pair. Cool. You've got them now, but no one could change that my parents did not care in the same way that some of these parents who really valued their children in a
mm-hmm,
different way.
mm-hmm,
And that is something, again, adults create complexities and
mm-hmm,
injustice spaces, and children navigate them with the wide-eyed sort of saucer eyes of like, "Oh, is that how it works? Is that what it is? Is that how it goes?" And I know for myself, there were times I look back and I cringe, when I was finding my way to who I wanted to be, parroting ugly things that I'd seen my older sister do or my mother do that were condescending or whatever. And then you come to a realization of like, that's just like smearing, feces on your face and saying, "Look at me." I mean, there's
Right,
really
right,
no
right,
way to do it. And,
right.
diminishing someone else's humanity or showing contempt for their vulnerability does not make you powerful. It makes you monstrous. And
Right.
we've revered monsters, of course, again, not a political show, but, like hearkening to our own recent history and even what's going on in Poland and certainly the Ukraine. I mean, this veneration of bullies,
Yeah.
and I saw that in college in a way that really put me off.
Hmm.
And again, sports culture is very much propelling toxic patriarchal thinking and valuing. So I mean, I think it's a funny thing. I look at Greta Thunberg and I think about her when she stood out there with that little sign, all by herself. And I saw that in the news. I thought, well, this girl's my hero. I have a script about John Muir that I've been trying to get made for 30 years that's been optioned, and all these people have been attached to it. I thought Leonardo DiCaprio was going to do it. Then he went and did The Revenant, which to me wasn't an environmental film. But again, it's like all of these things that you think to yourself, well, these are the important stories to tell. And there was this brave little girl, on the spectrum standing there saying, "Do right by me." And what she
Hmm.
got back from the world is, "Oh, you're this, you're brave, you're beautiful, you're wonderful." And all of that bullshit that just rises on the crest. And of course, for someone on the spectrum, it must be even more offensive and obvious that it's like a distraction campaign from the fact that none of the world leaders have really given. Years ago I worked for Vice on a really great project that was about using non conflict metals in technology, which is very
Hmm.
problematic
Yeah, I
because
can only imagine.
almost our phone, everything has
Yeah.
the horror of what's gone on in the Belgian Congo, the Republic of the, I don't even, I'm so bad about geography, but where it used to
Knitting the
be,
minerals. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
where they were already tortured by Baudouin as well as their
Yeah,
father. you
yeah.
know, it's like they are now being parasited on by predators who come and steal hand-minded. They do artisan. And I did this thing, I want to say in 2015 for Vice, and it was all about how Intel had committed to being conflict metal free. And they did this big campaign, and nobody's conflict metal free. It's
No,
still,
of course not.
and
And you
it's
can
like,
take the silver out of your mouth from the cavity that was filled, and so you can get buried wherever you want, but you're still surrounded by this stuff. I
that's right,
mean, what a
that's,
joke. It's a
that's right.
it's the irony. It's like a Sartre play.
It is. Oh my God, it's exactly like that. Or Moliere, where you're just, the French got it right, where it's like, chase your tail. And you believe so hard and you risk your life and you put it all on the line, and it's like, and it's worthless, and the very people that we revere. I mean, I remember years ago, and you'll relate to this, I was working as a set costumer on this horrible movie called Crack Wars, and I don't think it ever made it. It was being shot all on the Sony lot. It was very fakey fake, very early in the crack issues. It had to be like 90. And this fabulous woman was producing it, and I can't remember her last name. Beautiful, smart woman. And we were up late one night talking about, production. And I said to her, "Why did you leave the Cosby Show? You were such a huge success there. You're doing this crummy, stupid movie." And she had just left. And she told me that he had assaulted a woman, and she saw something that made her feel that it was wrong. And then she mentioned it to him, and suddenly there was a raise in her check, and she left because she didn't know what to do. And I remember driving home thinking, I can't remember her last name, but her first name was Sharon. I was like, did Sharon tank her whole career over something crazy? Because Cosby, no way. And even working in the industry and growing up on the periphery of it, my very close friend as a child was Anne Roth's daughter. So I grew up hanging out in the wardrobe houses. That's why I actually did wardrobe when I was trying to put myself through film school at USC, which was, so expensive.
Yeah.
And and making the films themselves, we had to pay for them and they were costly. Even if you're just feeding the actors and giving them a copy, because then you have to make prints, and it was, Super 8 and very expensive. And so I was working in film and television at the time, and I knew how many people showed up at the door with their junk hanging out, for a wardrobe fit, and how wildly, too, because it's that thing. They've talked to you on the phone. They think your voice is sexy. Suddenly you're going to their house for a wig check or a fitting, which, I would show up literally to have them hello, take off your pants. So that sort of crazy energy came out at me a lot. And I knew that. And there I was still going, God, Cosby, come on. And, it's just, the illusion is so powerful. I'm seduced by it too. I want to be seduced by it. I never want to lose the ability to disappear into a film. I don't ever want to look at it so technically, like I know there was a prop person hiding right behind that chair to be able to hand that thing the way that it worked. I don't want to see the seams so much that it ruins it.
Of course, you want to be an audience and be entertained and get lost in the storytelling. 100%. It's ironic because this is a little offshooting, but my husband and I, for that reason, would prefer to see a project where we don't know anybody, that they're not established, and yet you can't get a film made, technically speaking, without the finances of that name. Certainly in the world of the union A-list, leverage of that kind of caliber. On the contrary, an independent film, I mean, there again, who knows? Because when you and I were starting out in the independent world, that was very different. And yet my very first independent project was all well-known actors. That's the joke. And everyone thereafter was established actors.
Yeah.
So, and so they were already established SAG actors. But the rest of us crew were not. And that's an interesting conversation. And getting back to like the illusion versus the delusion versus the what we put out there, and what we ostracize versus what we idolize versus what we're willing to look straight on at versus what we turn our cheeks to. It's interesting because I've had on this podcast Marie P. Anderson, who is, I think we talked about her off this. She was behind Elite Modeling Agency in Ford, and she's now the CEO of Boss Babe Models. And she herself, so when I left for Chicago in for LA in 92, I did not realize, because as I was transitioning into independent films and doing less fashion and commercials at the time, I was still doing it, but not as much because I was busy doing like 3 films a year at the time. I did not know, not to bring her into the fold and her not be here to talk, but I didn't know that she was witnessing as an agent all the preemptive Me Too stuff, going back to the paralleling with the Cosby conversation. And it's interesting because also when I think back to my film career beginning, my very first film was like the winter of 1990, I think it was, when I got my first film. I mean, it was freaking cold as shit in Chicago. It was like learning how to dress for winter all over again. That's why I know it was a winter. It was like that October, November, December, something like that.
Lose your edge when you live out here. I remember, because I also have Chicago connections and roots.
Yeah.
And when the first winter I went back for Christmas when I was a freshman at USC, I was so cold. I cut a piece of fur up, cut eye holes and a mouth hole and a nose hole, and like attached it to my face. And then I couldn't get a cab because I looked like some chainsaw massacre. But the face thing, that like wind coming with knives of the wind and the like little spiky snow. And if you've been in LA, I don't know whether thickening blood is true or not, but if you haven't had that sort of fall ease into it, that cold, it's
cold out here. It's cold out here. I say that I have as many, if not more, coats out here. I was just discussing this with my oncology team, that when you do location work and you're working 24/7, you know, either crack of dawn or late at night or an all-nighter, and you're out here in the desert cold, and people are like, oh, whatever. They're just, and then they come out to California in December, January, February, March, and they go, oh my God, it's in the
Yeah.
30s. Well, 30 is 30. 32
Yeah.
is below freezing.
Yeah.
What makes you think that it's different in California than in the Midwest, than on the East Coast, than anywhere else in the world? Like, huh?
Well,
32
and it's
Fahrenheit
that
is
crazy.
32 Fahrenheit.
Well, and exactly. And it's that weird thing. Wardrobe has to think about it too. Warm up clothes. And so often
Yeah.
you're doping out and faking a season. So even if it's
Yeah.
nighttime and freezing, it's like they want someone in a little, like, you know, oh, a sundress with like a
Yeah.
little shawl. And you have to be ready, either standing by with a coat and pocket warmers. I mean, there were so many things that audiences don't realize that have to be done, and personal heaters for everybody, because it is. And it's Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, in a way, because, you know, the sun goes down and then it's the desert. So how cold was
Yes.
it for Lawrence of Arabia? That's exactly what it is here. And I
Yeah.
always tried to build in, as a costume designer, layers and
Yeah.
make a logic of it. Like tie it onto the backpack, there's a sweater, because I wanted to be able to integrate it for the actor, or mostly actresses, because they're so
Oh my
slender.
God.
I mean, I worked with Alyssa Milano on something where we were shooting like a 24-hour day. And then that was the main thrust of the movie. And then there were like 2 more story days just on the side. But in that course of a day, she's leaving the house at 4 a.m. She's here, she's there at night, da da da, and the sun and the heat. So I constructed a whole outfit. And Robert Downey Sr., Robert Downey Jr.'s father, literally wrote a scene into the film, because I said, look, I'm gonna have her in these cute little shorts. They're gonna be under her pants. There's a point where she'll take them, you know, off because it's too hot. I don't want her outside hot. So and he's like, oh, I'm gonna put that in a scene. And we had this cute little scene of her by her truck, like taking off her, and it made that functioning part of LA, which is a real part of LA, actually work for us in production, gave it a little character flavor, and, you know, and
Great
was right,
storytelling.
and
Great
kept,
storytelling.
yes, exactly. And clothing and makeup and hair are storytelling.
Yeah.
And we are storytellers. I mean, that's that thing that people forget. And trends. I was working on a show called The Closer. Now, I wasn't the costume designer on that. I was dramaturging for the lead actress. But the costume designer, who is an amazing man, Greg Lavoie, and he directed Sister Judy and the Delinquents, that little
Which, by
short.
the way, was so good. So
Oh,
good. We'll talk about that. So good.
Well,
Yeah.
he started dressing Brenda Lee Johnson. And it was an interesting thing, because when Kira first was doing it, Kira and I knew each other quite well, and I was already coming on and dramaturging with her. And she was like, I don't know, shouldn't I be wearing like a leather jacket and jeans? I don't know. And I said, no, no, no. He's doing something genius. He's making her a ladylike, because she comes from the South. And, you know, for my mother would never go out of the house in a way that she couldn't walk into some sort of ladies' luncheon tea of the, like, the sisters, you know, of the American Revolution, or whatever, the DAR.
Yeah.
You know, Daughters of the American Revolution, which she,
the DARS.
and you know, so it's like one of those things where you're just like, no, that's a character innovative thing that I didn't know the designer well at the time. And then we became great friends. And of course he ended up directing, but he started a fashion trend, and you could see it in the fashion. She was very popular. We were hitting all sorts of benchmarks for the greatest watchability in cable at the time. Cable was still growing. TNT was just a new network. And I watched Greg Lavoie's designs materially shift what I was seeing on the runway, a lot coming from Michael Kors. I felt like he was in love with me and kind of doing homages. But Greg was designing a character that was a woman who could look feminine and sexy without looking overly provocative or undermining her own ability and authority, and yet be ready to go. And that had not been presented. You know, we'd had Ally McBeal with the super short skirts, and my sister had been a designer on that show. She worked with Callista Flockhart. And, you know, that was a very trend-setting concept of like these ridiculously short skirts in the workplace, whatever that meant. I don't know why. I think it was some dude's idea of sexy. And, you know, that had its own trend, and I think Greg created that too. And I remember when I was doing commercials, and you probably feel this way too. I did a lot of commercials in the 90s,
Mhm.
tie-in for the Power Rangers with me, all sorts of like big concept ads that it would be like they did a Halloween ad, they did a Thanksgiving ad, they did a Christmas ad, they did a New Year's ad. So it was like lots of different ads in a packet. And I would go and buy stuff. And I'm not kidding you. The next like months, I would see people like recreating the outfits that they'd seen on the commercial,
Sure.
you know, and and certainly if you were, like anything from 90210 or whatever, those Dawson's Creek, those instantly translated. I always wanted to do a show that had product placement as integrally built into it. And the websites, it was before the web, that I was thinking is where you can like call up a home shopping network, was sort of what I was thinking. But now you could go right online and be like, I want the blouse from blah blah blah,
Yeah.
and they'd be
Well, it's
making.
ironic. I'm sorry. It's ironic because, even in this conversation and listening to you, one of the things that I was very aware of when the pandemic hit and I started pre the podcast getting launched, but connecting and launching other things business wise. I remember thinking, right up to the pandemic, influencers had really gained a lot of power. They gained a lot of power in the commercial world, in the promotional world, in their leveraging of what they got, with nothing other than because of how they were able to manage their own selves and how people felt for it. The joke of the matter is, just what you're talking about was a form of influencing.
Mhm.
What this is a form of influencing. Who we are as individuals are always a form of influencing. And why do I say that? And this is very interesting. When you hear somebody say, "Oh, I'm not a salesperson," and "Oh, I don't like sales," well, the truth of the matter is, we are always selling, we are always negotiating, we are always mm, going back and forth so we can get what we want or create what we need or
Oh,
solve that problem under the circumstance, and that's a sale.
yeah.
And again, I know that this conversation is going from the wind just blew this way, and now the wind just blew that way. And
Oh,
that's cool because it's a river that's flowing, this conversation.
okay.
Um, and it's rich because our brains are going 24/7. Like we can barely our mouths can barely catch up with our brains. It's funny. I
And
was
it's
out to breakfast.
exciting when
Go
people
ahead.
have similar ideas. I mean, that's, I think, when conversations, when you're with someone who either you have a lot of opposition to or a lot of agreement with, conversations tend to leap because it's like, oh, yes, I think that too. And, so then it has this dynamic energy, which talk shows of my childhood, I was very little. I lived in New York. They were all like that. They were like David
Love.
Susskind and Dick Cavett, and it would be like someone said something a little odd and people go, whoa, let's lean into that. They didn't like go commercial break, get away from the subject that's a hot potato. They took the hot potato. And in that note too, we had a lot more, and I think your podcast is filling those kind of voids. Remember how they used to do on PBS those kind of round tables with
Oh yeah, love,
leaders and all these different
love.
influencers in a big way, like this guy's a state's attorney and he's doing this, and they would talk about ideas. And I think sadly the accessibility is beautiful of the internet, but the lack of credible authority is very
Mhm,
devastating, and it's part
mhm.
of why the quick fire aspect of conspiracy and disinformation, even if it's a joke. I remember there was some guy who started some thing combatively as a joke to see how quickly it would spread through the internet, sort of like a telephone
Sure.
game. And then it turned and launched into a real conspiracy. And at the point that he was like, I am the author of this, it was always meant as a joke. He couldn't retract it.
No.
And, that's what this powerful form of influence allows, this incredible accessibility, which exceeds what we've ever had before. It's a gift, but it's a heavy axe to wield. And if you're using it to chop wood and build a house, that's great. But if you're throwing it around like some sort of psychic Viking, you're not in good shape. And I think we've got a lot of that going on. And the sales, it's interesting you say the sales thing, because my grandfather was an inventor and a salesman, and he was always like, don't be ashamed to sell yourself to sell. And it's hard as an artist. I think sometimes it undermines your credibility when you're standing there going, my work is good, my work is good, look, 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 my work is good. It's hard to get people to read it or look at it. It's part of why I actually created this book series, because I'm so thwarted with projects that I really care about, like Sisters and Delinquents. I have like 6 pilots that are really smart. I have this one thing that was passed on right when Succession was getting to be a huge hit, because they're like, oh, it's a little bit too much like Succession. I don't think it's anything like Succession. I think it's way better. Succession really upset me. It was hard to watch. But again, there's a marketplace for many more things. But even with women's stories, like on The Closer, we had one female writer who was let go in 7 seasons. Everything else was dictated by men. I was doing uncredited rewrites, which is its own weird conundrum. And you know, often I would share with them like the backstory that Kira had agreed. I gave her 5 options because she was given more of a resume rather than a backstory. As an actor, she wanted an emotional platform for certain changes that were reflected as statements in the pilot, and we were working on it, you know, when it was all very new. And I said, here are 5 different background stories that I think would work for this character. If you like one, you know, pick one and we'll work with that forever. And I made up a story about going to Myrtle Beach because the character grew up in Georgia, and going there on spring break for her high school thing. She's off to college. She's already in. She's going to be a major in dancing because they said that in the pilot, which really didn't connect to anything that was about her resume. And she goes to Myrtle Beach and her friend disappears, and the cops treat it like Girl Gone Wild, and she knows that wouldn't happen. And ultimately her friend is killed and found mutilated on the beach, and the cops are all like, oh gee, who knew? I mean, there's so many girls that go out and just go crazy, you know. And she decided, then I'm going to become a law enforcement officer. And there were episodes where being able to anchor it in that for 7 years gave us incredible traction. It was because from then on, and I wrote this in the first description, every victim is your friend, and nobody around that victim is your friend. You are friends with the victim. And that was a guiding principle that carried us. And, you know, decisions like that as an artist, it's almost like being a replicant in Blade Runner or something, like having that memory of the spider jar, or these things that are artificial plants, again, talking about like how artificial intelligence is affecting us all. As we as artists create characters, we are doing that same kind of scaffolding of persona, of personhood. And if we do it well, for any artist, you know, for myself playing the nun, which I've played in many iterations, and I have a whole backstory for Sister Judy and the Delinquents, I take great strength in that story. That story, whenever like I'm off book, or, you know, because it's an interactive play, the Late Night Catechism is an interactive play series, you go off book to engage with the audience, but you have to recenter. And that centering is based on who you are, just the way that you know who you are in your personhood. A character needs that. And often that's missed in a lot of these stories, especially for female characters, because they so often do this really creepy, lazy thing where they just take a man's journey into heroism and throw it on a woman. Like, she was this and she was that, and blah, blah. Women don't become heroes that way. They become heroes because someone is poisoning their children's water, or there's radium underneath their children's playground, or they're being beaten by their spouse, and now they see that their son is beating their girlfriend, and they have to become heroes. They don't pick to go make shit. Why? We shed blood to give life. We give life, and we know we're important, essential. Men created war and created ritual shedding of blood to say, I'm important too, I can take life. So they've set themselves, and again, not all men are toxic. Not all men see the power in taking life. Many men are nurturing and life-giving. These are gender normatives that are boxes for all of us, but the stereotypical concept of the male has a destructive force and the woman has a creative force. And because we've allowed our culture to trend to the male, we culturally have a destructive force instead of a creative, nurturing force. And that is being reflected back to us in fascist government and fascist religion that is not of Christ, because Christ wasn't doing the prosperity gospel. That's the devil's temptation. You can be powerful. You can be rich. You can have all this. That's not God energy. God already has it all. God
Right,
has
well, that's not a servant to energy, and I don't mean servant as in like a Egyptian slave servant
no.
mentality. I mean being of service,
Right.
because that's your pure truth, that's your
Yeah.
pure calling. And if the affluence and influence and wealth comes with that, okay,
It, isn't that
so be
wonderful?
it. Yeah,
Yes.
because then that
We
means
need that.
hopefully you can circle that back into
Right.
philanthropy and keep that cycle of your legacy going.
That's
And
right.
to your point, like, look, I mean, to me, wars are created because it's a business. Wars are created downright because it's all about making money. And it's about how does somebody become more powerful that way. And and I would like to think, even though women somehow or another, like I think women have gotten better at supporting one
Mm.
another. Um, but I was also raised with women who knew how to support, and we were not of the same blood. This is like a summer camp. This is boarding school. This is college. These are lots of women who,
Yeah.
and that is not to say that I did not come across a mean girl group or people who did not know how to play in the sandbox. But I
Mhm.
think that women do need to understand and carry the ball together in a much more collective, because one, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Two, the power of doing it collectively is just that. That's how you can change the world for the better.
Absolutely.
And we have to know that there's enough space for all of us to win.
Oh my
And
goodness.
we have to, like you use a word, probably 15 minutes back or so. It's like culture, like the thread, the needle and the thread is all culturally thread together. So throughout the world, and I said this to people, and I'm sure people are like, Jesus, what is she saying? But the sad truth is, women still in this day and age, as much as people have achieved in women, the truth is there's not a whole lot of women CEOs still throughout the world.
Oh my
The
God.
truth of the matter is that women are still considered second class citizens in
We
most of
are.
the world.
We
That
are.
women are really in most cultures only here to procreate and then to be shut
Mhm.
up. And I don't need to get off on that tangent because it doesn't energetically fuel me. But I do think the awareness of when women think, oh, look at me, I've achieved this and da 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 da. And maybe I've even fallen into that category of sorts. I mean, but it's a big, it's a big win to be able to, say that you consistently work in a field that has no guarantees and you can
Dude,
achieve certain achievement, even when we're dealing with a two-class system and all the things. Okay, great. So let's put that aside. The truth is the bigger picture, this morning at this breakfast I was at, with this beautiful couple, and the wife, ironically, I had also not seen in like 20 years, and I do not know why that relationship just kind of like,
busy.
but life gets busy, and
Yes.
there was nothing other than that was it.
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
so grateful to be reconnected to her, like being reconnected to you, like it's like symbiotic. And
Mhm.
but she said to her husband, to me, she's like, you know who Felicia is? Felicia's like Oz. She like knows everything and she's behind. And I went, well, what? Like, I mean, I don't see myself that way. She's like, oh, no, no, no. No, you know a lot about it. And I'm like, no, I don't think I really do, but I definitely am curious, and this is why I do this platform. And even the talk shows, Jocelyn, that we grew up as kids, I was on the edge of my seat. I was like, if I was near a television screen, it was because of those fabulous, enriching conversations that I just wanted to be a part of. And to your point, ironically, this female friend, how she and I met was on Politically Incorrect. Well,
Oh
that's kind of the
my God.
current contemporary roundtable.
Yeah.
That's the most roundtable in our more recent times. And I was saying to her, the thing that I loved so much about doing that show was because I was interacting with this rich, colorful,
Yes.
fiber of people who brought
Yeah.
to the table all these different, experiences and beliefs and successes, and it wasn't, it didn't feel ego driven, and it didn't feel narcissistic. It felt like
I
we're
did
just so happy to be here and to have this really
talk about
colorful
it.
conversation led by
Yes.
this human being
Yeah.
called Bill Maher. And
Yes.
and that to me is like, I mean, there's nothing better than like a great delicious dinner party
I
full of
agree.
laughter and
And
interesting
conversation.
conversation. To me, it's like a multiple orgasm. To me, it's like the ultimate, like, oh my
Yeah.
god, I like feel it from head to toe, and I leave the party so fulfilled and so much better than I came, no pun intended. And
Much better that you came.
yeah, and that I came, yes, and again. And so I mean, I realize that, and again, the reason why I do this platform is because, and when people are like 2 hours, there's no way I can talk for 2 hours, and I'm like, no, actually, you can. You can if you give yourself permission. And you can because I certainly know how to do it, and I'm going to lead the way. I just did a 1 minute post about the power of connection. And I'm sure people are like, what the fuck is she talking about? Well, she doesn't show a makeup effect, or she doesn't. No, because not because I can't. My God, I've been doing that
Oh,
for 80 hours a week for
that's how you
30
might.
plus years. I mean, if you need to see that, and I'm happy to show you, no problem. But there's so much when, if you can't create connection, then you can't then create ideas and visions and stories, and then take it to a further place, which is now entertainment or
Yeah.
books or whatever. Like, you gotta like have a runway, and it starts with
Yeah.
connection. So to the point of the reason why it was so important to create this platform, like a decade ago I wanted to do this. And ironically, when I met my producers, who were like, of all people, you need to do this, is not about me so much as the importance of proving to people, whether it's my guests or to the audience, that we as a society are thirsty, are hungry for connection, for an actual conversation, that we don't have to fit into this formula or this 2 minute video, because we don't have the attention span. The truth is if you were at summer camp, or if you were at where you didn't have distractions and you just had each other, and you needed to rely on one another, as we as human beings truthfully really do. That's all we got. Our greatest bank account, this is what I say, our greatest bank account is each other, our exchange. Now, I'm not talking about the dollar, I'm talking about
Yeah.
us.
The
And
human.
so, right? So, I say to people, without all those other distractions, the phone, the television, the all the things. And I right now, where I'm sitting, I could be distracted by so many things,
Yeah.
but I'm completely honed in here. And my point is that I believe the value of sharing life experiences. I believe the value in exchanging ideas. I believe the value of proving that conversations are absolutely vital in our world, because if we don't have communication, we have breakdown,
We
we
do.
have dysfunction, and therefore we do not. I mean, this is why we have divorce, this is why you said we have violence, this is why all the things, because people don't want to, they would rather like, I didn't hear you, and wait, I'm going over here to be
Oh, but
distracted.
now we have this to distract ourselves. I mean, it's the craziest thing. I have it here because I was texting you and I couldn't get back in.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
that, we are permanently distracted. And here's the thing too. Art, and not to be didactic or finger wagging, art that is a distraction is wonderful and worthy. But even the most confectionery art, to me, should have thematic underpinnings that have deeper meanings. And one of the tragedies when I first saw the trend in Marvel comic films and things like that, excuse me, I I
Mhm,
didn't think it was necessarily so bad, especially because some of it was racial equity and correcting some imbalances about, like, let's tell some of these stories. But
mhm.
as it got into such a franchise, I think again, it lost sight of even the impulse of the Marvel comics and of the DC comics, who were all social justice action people. They were writing and they were taking a realm that not everyone was monitoring, and it wasn't so expensive that anyone was so afraid to talk about incendiary topics. And they leaned into anti-fascism, pro-women. It's, Wonder Woman and all of the things about Wonder Woman, that were about a woman's power. All of those things were not on trend in the Hollywood world at that
Oh, yeah.
time. They in the vanguard of social justice. They were using an art form much the way graphic novels do now, or even some of the people who are trying to do interesting things on TikTok. Although I haven't really explored that realm, I've seen some things and podcasts too, where again, low cost, even the black and white films of the kind of morally conscious films of Hollywood. The reason that lighting was so moody is they had a limited lighting package, but look, they made it work for them.
I cannot wait for you to tune in next week to hear the rest of this conversation with Jocelyn. In the meantime, share and subscribe as we're building the Camp Fifi Uncensored community to something that we know these conversations through connections are super important to be sharing and highlighting, because gathering around the campfire authentically and really making a connection with one another is something that we are just all so hungry for. And this is the platform that shares how it's possible, with entertainment, with inspiration, and with enlightenment, and just raw conversation of people's life experiences shared. So can't wait for you to join us next week for episode 106, part 2, with our guest Jocelyn Wright. And remember, we can be heard on all listening platforms, and our season 1 through 3, our library of content, is available for listening at any time. Thank you so much for joining us. Much love, and bye for now.